Lesson 10. Volunteering as a form of social therapy. In the previous lesson, we explored why helping others can serve a therapeutic function in the treatment of depression and which behavioral and relational mechanisms underlie this effect. At this stage, however, it is necessary to take the next step to move from the level of a general idea to the level of a concrete form. Helping is not a uniform activity. Different places, roles, and environments carry different emotional loads, levels of responsibility, and clinical risks. What is stabilizing for one person may be overwhelming or even destructive for another. For this reason, in social therapy, the key factor is not simply taking action, but selecting the appropriate form of volunteering. Contrary to common belief, not every act of helping is healing, and not every exposure to another person's suffering is therapeutic. The effectiveness of this intervention depends on precise matching of the environment to the stage of recovery, the level of emotional regulation, and the individual sensitivity of the person with depression. When this match is lacking, the most common outcomes are discouragement, a sense of failure, or secondary deterioration of mental health. This lesson therefore has an organizing and selective purpose. Its aim is not to encourage volunteering as such, but to show how it can be treated as a therapeutic tool when it makes sense, in what form, under what limitations, and with what safeguards. Instead of a moral narrative, this section offers an analysis of environments, roles, and burdens that in practice determine whether volunteering will support recovery or become another source of strain. In the following part of the lesson, the most common forms of caregiving-oriented volunteering will be discussed, together with their therapeutic profiles, indications, and contraindications. This will allow the reader not only to understand the differences between various environments, but also to realistically assess which of them, if any, may be safe and helpful at a given stage of recovery. 1. Volunteering as a therapeutic structure, not spontaneous help. From a clinical perspective, volunteering that is meant to serve a therapeutic function cannot be understood as a spontaneous impulse of the heart or an ad hoc way of doing something good. It is precisely the lack of structure that makes help, however sincerely motivated, burdensome or ineffective for people with depression. In social therapy, volunteering becomes a tool only when it provides a framework that assumes part of the regulatory functions otherwise carried by a weakened psychological system. A therapeutic structure means, above all, clearly defined time, place, and scope of duties. A person with depression should not have to decide each time whether they have the strength to help today, whom to help, and in what way. Such decisions generate tension and easily trigger avoidance mechanisms. When the framework is set in advance, volunteering works despite low motivation, because it is based on commitment rather than on current emotional state. From a clinical point of view, this is crucial. Action precedes improvement in mood, not the other way around. Equally important is the institutional context of volunteering. Helping that is embedded within an organization, such as an orphanage, care home, hospice, or shelter, provides not only logistical support but also psychological safety. The presence of a coordinator, a team, and procedures means that responsibility does not rest solely on the individual. For a person with depression, this is a protective factor that prevents excessive guilt, over-responsibility, and fear of making mistakes. Structure also serves as an emotional filter. In organized volunteering, contact with suffering is moderated and embedded in tasks, rather than based on unrestricted emotional resonance. As a result, the caregiving relationship does not turn into emotional entanglement, which in depression could lead to overload or secondary deterioration. Boundaries here are not a barrier to empathy, but a condition for its sustainability. Finally, the structure of volunteering organizes the rhythm of the day and week, which has therapeutic value in itself. Fixed hours, repetitive activities, and environmental predictability stabilize psychological functioning, especially in individuals with disturbances of sleep, concentration, and energy. Volunteering then ceases to be an addition to life and begins to function as an external scaffold on which a sense of agency and meaning can gradually be rebuilt. Understood in this way, volunteering is neither a form of self-sacrifice nor a moral test. It is a therapeutic tool whose effectiveness depends on the quality of the framework in which it takes place. Only against this background does it become meaningful to compare different volunteering environments and assess their suitability at various stages of recovery, a task to which the next part of the lesson will be devoted. 2. Where helping heals, and where it begins to overwhelm. In therapeutic practice, the key question is not where it is worth helping, but where helping is bearable at a given moment. Different volunteering environments carry very different psychological loads, even if from the outside they all appear to be helping others. What determines their therapeutic potential does not lie in the idea of help itself, but in the everyday experience of the person entering that environment. There are places that bring order, and there are places that destabilize. The former usually have a steady rhythm, repetitive tasks, and clearly defined roles. One day looks similar to the next, tasks are predictable, and responsibility is shared within a team. For a person with depression, such predictability can be crucial. Not because it is easy, but because it does not require constant adaptation to change, which in depression quickly depletes psychological resources. Under these conditions, helping becomes a carrier of rhythm rather than another source of tension. Other environments are emotionally intense. Contact with strong suffering, frustration, aggression, or loss may be part of everyday reality. Examples include youth shelters or settings that work with people in acute crisis, where emotions are vivid, fluctuating, and often difficult to bring to closure. For someone in the early stages of recovery, such contact does not have to be therapeutic. It may lead to overload, a sense of helplessness, or secondary deterioration of mood. This does not mean these are bad places, it simply means they require a level of psychological stability that depression often does not allow at the beginning. A particularly important factor is the level of responsibility associated with a given form of helping. Where the safety or well-being of others depends on the volunteer's decisions, tension and fear of making mistakes naturally arise. In depression, where guilt and excessive responsibility are often heightened, such a burden can be difficult to carry. For this reason, auxiliary roles tend to work better therapeutically, roles in which someone else holds primary responsibility and the volunteer is part of a larger whole. Helping then ceases to be a test of character and becomes an opportunity to be useful without the pressure of perfection. It also matters whether helping is done alone or in the presence of other adults. Environments with a team, a coordinator, or even the possibility of talking after a difficult day have a completely different impact than actions undertaken in isolation. The presence of others not only distributes responsibility but also normalizes emotional responses. What is difficult stops being a personal failure and becomes part of a shared experience. For a person with depression, this difference is profound. Finally, it must be said clearly, not every environment requires heroism, and not everyone should. Places that truly support recovery do not force constant self-overcoming. They do not test endurance, demand sacrifice, or expect emotional martyrdom. They allow helping within current capacities, not against them. If helping begins to resemble a struggle against one's own mental state, it is a sign that the environment has been chosen too early or incorrectly. For this reason, therapeutic volunteering is not a one-time decision, but a process of ongoing adjustment. What was too difficult at the beginning may become possible later. What was helpful at one stage may no longer be needed at another. In the next part of this lesson, we will look at specific volunteering environments, not to rank them morally, but to understand the different burdens they carry and at which stages of recovery they may make sense. 3. Centers where volunteering is possible. The rules governing volunteering differ significantly depending on the country and region of the world. In countries with well-developed social care systems, volunteering is usually strictly regulated, and access to work involving dependent individuals is often limited. For example, in the United Kingdom, before being allowed to engage in any activities, volunteers are required to complete specific trainings, introductory courses, and provide a criminal record check. Only after meeting these conditions can a volunteer be assigned to clearly defined tasks. In countries with less developed systems, formal requirements are usually minimal or non-existent. In practice, the only condition for international volunteering may be the appropriate type of visa. The lack of regulation applies not only to recruitment procedures but also to the organization of caregiving work itself. In many such places, duties are poorly defined, hierarchies unclear, and daily functioning relies on improvisation and ad hoc decisions. While such environments may be perceived as more flexible, they can also be burdensome and disorganizing, especially for individuals with mental health difficulties. These differences are particularly visible in approaches to institutional structure. In Europe, volunteer roles are usually precisely described, the scope of responsibility is limited, and relationships are governed by a clearly defined hierarchy. This model supports organizational order and reduces uncertainty about expectations. In many developing countries, by contrast, a less formal approach prevails, where boundaries of responsibility are fluid and the quality of care depends largely on individuals rather than on the system. In highly developed countries, direct access for volunteers to institutional facilities, such as orphanages, care homes, or specialist centers, is often restricted or entirely closed. However, indirect cooperation remains possible, most often through non-governmental organizations operating around these institutions. Such NGOs run, for example, community centers, mentoring programs, support groups, and preventive initiatives carried out outside institutional walls. In so-called third world countries, non-governmental organizations play a very diverse role. Alongside entities genuinely pursuing aid-related goals, there are also structures that formally hold charitable status but in practice operate in a way strongly oriented toward fundraising. In such cases, the quality of care and real assistance may become secondary to economic objectives. Understanding these differences is crucial for individuals considering volunteering as part of their recovery process. The overview above is intended to show how different forms of volunteering function in practice in various parts of the world, and what organizational and environmental realities one may encounter, both locally and abroad. For orphanages as a volunteering environment, how they function in practice. An orphanage is a form of collective childcare institution in which children live permanently in one place and care is provided by rotating staff. Regardless of the region of the world, this model shares common structural features: group care, a daily schedule, staff hierarchy, and limited individualization of the caregiver-child relationship. Differences between countries concern primarily sources of funding, the level of institutional oversight, and the role volunteers play in the day-to-day functioning of the facility. In countries with well-developed social care systems, Western Europe, Canada, Australia, traditional orphanages are now rare or operate under highly regulated forms. Children are usually placed there only temporarily, and volunteering, if it exists at all, is auxiliary and limited in scope. Volunteers rarely serve as direct caregivers. More often, they assist with logistics, support group activities, or perform organizational tasks. Access to children is frequently restricted by procedures, and contact tends to be indirect and closely supervised. In the practical operation of orphanages in many parts of the world, one of the most serious problems involves systemic abuse driven by financial incentives rather than by isolated staff misconduct. In regions where institutional care is partially or fully funded by foreign donations, short-term volunteering, and so-called voluntourism, children effectively become the financial base of the institution. The greater the number of children, and the stronger the emotional appeal, visible deprivation, the greater the interest from donors. In some countries, this mechanism has led to the active recruitment of children into institutions, regardless of their actual family situation. A well-documented example is Cambodia, where for years practices were recorded involving the purchase of children from impoverished families or persuading parents to place their children temporarily in orphanages. Families were promised education, food, and a better future, while children remained in institutions that generated a steady inflow of funds from volunteers and tourists. In practice, the child ceased to be the beneficiary of care and became an economic asset. In response to these phenomena, WHO and UNICEF have pointed out that institutional care financed through short-term volunteering and foreign donations carries a high risk of structural abuse, as keeping a child in an institution can be more profitable than reintegrating them with their family. In Tanzania, the mechanism looks different, but leads to similar outcomes. The vast majority of children living in so-called orphanages are not actual orphans. They have living parents or extended family, but are placed in institutions for purely economic reasons. Lack of resources for education, food, or healthcare leads families to entrust their child to an institution that in practice functions as a boarding school. Formally, these are orphanages. In reality, they substitute for an education social support system that does not function locally. WHO notes that such institutions do not resolve the problem of poverty or exclusion, but merely shift it from the family level to the institutional level. The child receives food and education, but at the cost of weakening or severing family bonds and reinforcing a model in which the institution replaces community support, and performing roles for sponsors becomes a means of securing funding. Systemically, this is a stopgap solution. From the child's perspective, its long-term impact is ambivalent. In many parts of the developing world, the boundary between legitimate institutional care and charitable business is fluid. Facilities formally registered as aid organizations may in reality operate as private ventures, prioritizing financial survival over family reintegration or community-based solutions. WHO and UNICEF emphasize that the greater the reliance on foreign funding and short-term volunteers, the higher the risk of perpetuating such models. For a person considering volunteering, especially someone living with depression, it is crucial to understand that contact with children in orphanages often occurs within a context of systemic contradictions. A volunteer may genuinely help a child in everyday life while simultaneously being part of a structure that exists precisely because the child remains institutionalized. WHO does not frame this as an accusation against individuals, but as a description of a mechanism in which good intentions and real help can coexist with systems that generate abuse. In the African context, volunteering in children's homes means direct contact with the brutality of life that usually remains outside the European field of vision. A significant proportion of children entering care facilities have histories of extreme trauma, rape, severe physical abuse, long-term neglect resulting in disability, hunger, lack of medical care, and violence from adults who should have provided protection. These experiences are not incidental, they are part of many children's biographies. In practice, this means that a volunteer very quickly encounters realities that in Europe would belong in court records or child psychiatric wards. An 8-year-old child who has experienced sexual violence and is living with HIV is not an exception in this context, but one of many real stories. Illness here is not an abstraction or a diagnosis on paper, it is present in daily life, in medications taken, physical limitations, and in the child's awareness, which often exceeds what their age would suggest. For the volunteer, this entails confronting a reality in which injustice is not symbolic but inscribed in the child's body and psyche. There is no institutional distance or systemic buffer. The volunteer can be present and help with daily tasks, but has no tools to undo what has already happened. For some people with depression, such confrontation can be profoundly regulating. Their own problems may diminish in significance when faced with the real tragedies of others. For others, however, it exceeds adaptive capacity and leads to secondary trauma, helplessness, or worsening depressive symptoms. This is not a matter of moral sensitivity, but of genuine psychological resilience. Therefore, volunteering in Tanzanian children's homes is not a harder version of helping, but an entry into a world where violence, illness, and neglect are part of the everyday landscape. Understanding this harsh reality is a necessary precondition for any decision to engage, especially when volunteering is intended as part of one's own therapeutic process. One must be mentally prepared for such confrontation. In everyday practice, orphanage life is built around repetition. The day is divided into blocks: waking up, meals, school or activities, free time, sleep, This structure can be stabilizing for volunteers, as it imposes rhythm and reduces the need for independent planning. At the same time, relationships are short-term and multiple. Each child interacts with many adults, and each volunteer with many children. For a person with depression, this means that relationships are intense but shallow and frequently interrupted, which can be either burdensome or protective, depending on emotional sensitivity. Regional differences are particularly visible in the volunteer's role. In highly regulated countries, the volunteer is an adjunct to the system and carries no decision-making responsibility. In countries with weaker structures, the volunteer may be essential to the facility's daily functioning. This brings greater agency, but also greater psychological load. For someone with depression, it is crucial to understand that these are fundamentally different experiences, even though they share the same formal label, volunteering in an orphanage. From a therapeutic perspective, orphanages offer a specific combination of structure and emotional stimuli. The daily routine and clear role can help stabilize circadian rhythm and a sense of usefulness. At the same time, contact with children activates strong emotional responses, care, compassion, attachment, and sometimes helplessness. For a person with high emotional sensitivity, this environment can be intense, especially during longer stays or without adequate recovery breaks. International volunteering in orphanages differs from local volunteering not only culturally, but also organizationally. Abroad, volunteers more often live on the premises or nearby, which reduces the separation between work and rest. This can increase a sense of meaning and immersion in action, but simultaneously reduces space for emotional regulation. Local volunteering usually allows a clearer division between helping time and private time, which can be protective in depression. It is also important to note that volunteering is not only about playing with children, although it often looks that way. Many facilities struggle with a lack of staff for laundry, cleaning, and cooking, tasks that are monotonous and physically demanding, yet essential to daily life in an orphanage. Very often it is necessary to clearly define one's boundaries with management to avoid discomfort when declining certain forms of help. In summary, the orphanage as a volunteering environment offers high availability of meaning and relational contact, but with variable emotional intensity depending on the country and operational model. Volunteering in Western countries may be difficult or impossible to access, while in less developed countries it is often readily available but less formally organized. For a person with depression, the key question is not whether a facility is good or bad, but how emotionally demanding it is, how stable its rhythm is, and how much responsibility it places on the volunteer. These factors determine whether the environment will be supportive or overwhelming. 5. Youth shelters, how they function in practice. Youth shelters are crisis intervention institutions whose primary task is not long-term care or upbringing, but crisis management. They serve young people who have run away from home, street-involved youth, and those with histories of violence, neglect, addiction, conflict with the law, or migration. Regardless of the country, a shared feature of these facilities is high population turnover, constant rotation of residents, and ongoing tension rooted in the unstable life histories of the young people involved. In highly developed countries, youth shelters typically form part of a broader system of social intervention. They operate in connection with social services, courts, schools, and healthcare. Formally, they have rules, safety procedures, and staff hierarchies. In practice, however, day-to-day functioning still centers on extinguishing immediate crises, conflicts between residents, episodes of aggression, relapses into substance use, running away from the facility, or police interventions. In such environments, a volunteer most often plays an auxiliary, on-call, or logistical role, and more rarely an educational or mentoring one. In developing countries, youth shelters often function as substitutes for an entire support system that effectively does not exist. A single facility may combine the functions of a night shelter, a feeding point, a crisis intervention center, and a semi-formal school. Organizational structure can be loose, staff numbers insufficient, and rules variable. Under such conditions, a volunteer often becomes a component that keeps the daily operation running, and the scope of their work depends more on immediate needs than on a predefined role. Regardless of region, the youth shelter environment is characterized by a high level of unpredictability. Days rarely resemble one another, tension escalates and subsides abruptly, and residents' emotions can be intense and difficult to regulate. In practice, this means frequent contact with anger, frustration, manipulation, boundary testing, and risk-taking behaviors. Relationships are short-lived, unstable, and often interrupted, which makes it difficult to build continuity of contact. For a person with depression, the key point is that a youth shelter is an environment where it is not the structure that carries the person, but the person who must constantly adapt to a structure that keeps changing. Unlike orphanages or care homes, where the daily rhythm is often stable, youth shelters are dominated by sudden, unplanned situations. This requires quick reactions, stress tolerance, and the capacity for emotional distance. The volunteer role in a youth shelter is particularly ambivalent. On the one hand, real support is possible: presence, conversation, help with everyday tasks, and relieving the staff. On the other hand, the volunteer often operates at the intersection of conflicting expectations: to be emotionally available yet detached, helpful yet not overly involved, responsive yet compliant with procedures. For someone with reduced emotional regulation, this arrangement can be exhausting. International volunteering in youth shelters adds further intensity. Language barriers, cultural differences, and the lack of clear separation between work time and private time mean the volunteer is in the environment almost constantly. This can produce a strong sense of meaning and engagement, but it can also lead to rapid overload, especially if the person has limited opportunities for psychological recovery. When taking on volunteering in a youth shelter, it is crucial to clearly define one's responsibilities and level of accountability before beginning. In practice, many such facilities leave the volunteer considerable freedom to choose which activities they participate in and which they prefer to withdraw from. This flexibility makes it possible to adjust the form of involvement to the volunteer's current psychological and physical capacity. Youth shelters often allow volunteers to lead activities aligned with their skills or experience. This may include art, music, sports, technical workshops, or simple do-it-yourself projects. Such activities are usually informal and not rigidly imposed by a program, which allows substantial freedom in shaping their content and flow. This action-based, direct contact form of work can be, for some people with depression, a helpful element of self-regulation and rebuilding a sense of agency. At the same time, a basic safety principle is to avoid leading activities alone. In a youth shelter environment, residents' behaviors can be impulsive and difficult to predict, so the presence of a trusted co-worker or staff member is an important safeguard. A second person helps distribute responsibility, respond to crisis situations, and relieve the volunteer when the group becomes difficult to manage. It is also important to recognize that volunteering in a youth shelter involves direct contact with residents' real-life tragedies. In practice, these are stories of domestic violence, sexual abuse, the death of a parent, rape, addiction, conflict with the law, street experiences, or long-term neglect. For the volunteer, this means confronting existentially heavy problems that are neither abstract nor theoretical. For some people with depression, such confrontation can lead to a relativization of one's own difficulties. Internal problems that previously occupied the entire mental space may, when placed next to others' tangible suffering, lose some of their subjective intensity. This is not a mechanism of repression or denial of one's symptoms, but a natural shift of perspective in which attention moves toward external reality and concrete action. In practice, a youth shelter is not a therapeutically neutral environment. For some people, especially at a later stage of recovery, with pharmacotherapy in place and the mind more settled, it can be an excellent space for rebuilding agency and stress tolerance. For those whose depression is dominated by anxiety, insomnia, irritability, or low tolerance for chaos, this environment may become a worsening factor rather than a stabilizing one. In such cases, volunteering should be postponed until one's condition is more stable. 6. Nursing homes, how they function in practice. Nursing homes are long-term care institutions whose primary goal is not treatment or rehabilitation, but the maintenance of everyday functioning for older people, often those with reduced physical, cognitive, or social capacity. Regardless of the country, this environment is characterized by low event dynamics, repetitive daily routines, and a clearly defined organizational hierarchy. In contrast to youth shelters, nursing homes are stable and predictable structures. In highly developed countries, care homes operate under strict regulations. The roles of staff and volunteers are clearly defined, and a volunteer's scope of responsibility is usually limited to companionship, conversation, assistance with simple activities, or organizing light activation programs. Direct medical and nursing care remains the responsibility of full-time staff. For the volunteer, this means a low level of decision-making and minimal risk of sudden emergencies, but also limited autonomy. In developing countries, nursing homes are far less common and often exist in semi-formal forms. Care for older people traditionally rests with the family, so such institutions usually appear only in urban areas or in connection with religious or charitable organizations. Organizational structures tend to be simplified, staff numbers low, and volunteers more frequently involved in daily tasks such as helping with meals, cleaning, or accompanying bedridden residents. This implies more direct contact, but also greater physical and emotional burden. Daily life in a nursing home is slow and monotonous. Days resemble one another, and the range of stimuli is limited. Conversation, shared meals, short activities, and long periods of inactivity dominate. For a person with depression, this rhythm can have a dual effect. On one hand, predictability and low stimulation can help calm the nervous system and reduce tension. On the other hand, monotony and constant contact with helplessness may intensify feelings of emptiness or meaninglessness, especially for those who require greater dynamism. Relationships with residents in nursing homes are usually long-term but low in intensity. Volunteers encounter loneliness, gradual loss of independence, chronic illness, and memory problems, including dementia. In many cases, contact consists more of simple presence than active intervention. For some people with depression, being sufficiently present, without pressure to achieve results, can be a regulating and relieving experience. International volunteering in nursing homes is rarely large-scale. It most often involves facilities run by religious organizations or local NGOs. Volunteer stays tend to be longer, and the boundary between work time and personal time is less clearly defined. On one hand, this can increase a sense of meaning and relational continuity. On the other, it can lead to gradual overload if clear rest boundaries are not maintained. In Tanzania, for example, volunteering in facilities for older people can be particularly disturbing. Nursing homes are most often closed institutions with extremely limited resources, minimal staff, and almost no organizational infrastructure. Basic hygiene supplies, medications, and even regular food deliveries are often lacking. Living conditions are starkly simplified, and daily life is reduced to maintaining minimal order. In such facilities, mortality rates are very high. Older people admitted without severe somatic illnesses, aside from age-related bodily decline, often die shortly after arrival. This is not due to a single factor, but to the accumulation of neglect, malnutrition, lack of medical care, and social isolation. Staff do not focus on prolonging the lives of severely ill residents, as facilities are chronically overcrowded and resources extremely scarce. The priority becomes freeing space rather than providing long-term care. As a result, older people experiencing homelessness and lacking family support often fear nursing homes. In practice, they prefer to survive in extremely harsh street conditions, relying on food scraps or occasional help from youth shelters, rather than be transported to a care facility. In their perception, a nursing home is not a place of help, but a final stage after which little follows. The few facilities offering relatively stable conditions are usually run by the Catholic Church or NGOs connected to religious institutions. These differ significantly from state-run homes, both in organization and in approach to care. Even so, they remain places with limited capacity, operating under conditions of permanent resource scarcity. In the Tanzanian context, the primary form of care for older people remains the family, even when economic conditions make adequate care impossible. Home care is often extremely burdensome, spread across several people or resting on a single woman in the family. In this context, the most reasonable and least destructive form of help is often to support the family in caregiving, rather than transferring the older person to an institution. Volunteering then consists of taking on a small portion of the burden, helping with shopping, feeding, hygiene, or simple presence, which can significantly improve the senior's quality of life without removing them from their natural environment. For a volunteer, especially one struggling with depression, contact with Tanzanian nursing homes is a boundary experience. This environment brutally exposes the consequences of systemic poverty and the absence of long-term care structures. It can lead to a profound shift in perspective, but also to psychological overload. Understanding these realities is essential before making any decision to engage in such facilities. From a therapeutic perspective, a nursing home in the developed world is an environment with low chaos and high predictability, but also with constant exposure to themes of aging, dependence, and the gradual loss of agency. For people with depression marked by high anxiety and sensitivity to loss of control, this can be difficult. For those overwhelmed by excessive stimulation and tension, it can be stabilizing. Nursing homes are neither easy nor hard environments in an objective sense. They are calm environments with heavy emotional content. For a person with depression, the key is understanding that volunteering in such a place is less about action and change, and more about enduring silence, repetition, and another person's helplessness. It is precisely this quality that determines whether the environment will support the healing process or inhibit it. 7. Hospice as a therapeutic environment, without illusions and without fear. A hospice is one of the few places where life is not pretended. There is no social performance, no future plans, no ambition, and no narrative of success. There is presence, time, and relationship. For a person suffering from depression, especially one immersed in emotional emptiness and a sense of meaninglessness, such a context can be surprisingly enlivening rather than burdensome. Depression is an illness in which the social mask begins to chafe unbearably. What for healthy people remains a routine effort, pretending stability, control, meaning, and a normality, for a person with depression becomes a burden exceeding their capacity. Every conversation, every role, every "how are you" requires energy that is no longer available. In a hospice, this problem disappears, because masks cease to be useful. People at the end of life do not negotiate their image or the future consequences of their words. They say what they feel, because there is no one left to hide from and no reason to do so. Only what is happening here and now matters: presence, honesty, and real emotions. For a person with depression, contact with such a world can be profoundly relieving. For the first time in a long while, they do not have to pretend in order to be accepted. Additionally, in a hospice it is not the person with depression who is at the center of attention. Someone else is dying. This is a fundamental difference. The volunteer does not have to explain anything, achieve anything, or get back on track. They can simply be. In a relationship with a dying person, the mechanisms of evaluation, comparison, and expectation, so often paralyzing for people with depression in ordinary relationships, do not operate. The relationship is simple, direct, and intense, grounded in the fact that time is running out. A dying person very often actively forms an emotional bond with a caregiver or volunteer. They cling to the relationship as a final point of reference. This is not a metaphor, but an observable psychological mechanism. For a person with depression who has not felt, reacted, or experienced emotional movement for months or years, such a bond can become the first real emotional stimulus in a long time. Crucially, it is a bond free of claims and future obligations. There is no fear of abandonment, betrayal, or disappointment. Contrary to common belief, hospice volunteers rarely become emotionally entangled in a destructive way. The bond is genuine, but its temporal horizon is clear from the outset. Death is not a sudden rupture of the relationship, but its natural completion. Over time, contact with dying ceases to be shocking and becomes part of reality. For many volunteers, this does not lead to emotional numbness, but to a re-evaluation of their own fears and problems, which, when confronted with the real end of life, lose their absolute character. A hospice is not a safe place in an emotional sense, but it is an honest one. It does not protect from confrontation with impermanence, suffering, and death. At the same time, this confrontation can be paradoxically stabilizing for people with depression. Death ceases to be an abstract fear and becomes a concrete process that can be seen, understood, and made familiar. Many people, after such an experience, begin to view their own lives differently, not as a problem to be solved, but as a fact that is still ongoing. In European countries, hospices operate within structures that remove the burden of medical responsibility from volunteers. This allows them to focus on relationship, conversation, and presence. In less developed countries, hospices may be harsher and lack safeguards, but the relational mechanism remains the same: contact with someone at the edge of existence and the awareness that nothing needs to be fixed or changed. Hospice is not for everyone and not at every stage. Not because it is too difficult, but because it requires readiness to look at life without veils. For a person with depression stuck in sterile suffering, such a confrontation can, however, become a turning point. It does not heal in a medical sense, but it can restore contact with reality and sometimes with one's own emotions. A hospice does not teach how to live long. It teaches why it is worth living at all. And that is precisely why, in some cases, it can be one of the most meaningful volunteer environments for a person suffering from depression. 8. Other forms of helping volunteering: what they really offer, and what they do not. Beyond institutional volunteering, such as hospices, orphanages, or care homes, there exists a broad range of helping activities with a lower threshold of entry and a smaller existential burden. These forms of volunteering are often more locally accessible, less formalized, and easier to combine with the everyday functioning of a person suffering from depression. This does not mean, however, that they are automatically easy or unambiguously therapeutic. Organizations that distribute meals to people experiencing homelessness offer contact with individuals in crisis, but in a short, task-oriented, repetitive format. Volunteers rarely enter into deep relationships. The contact is limited to a few minutes, sometimes just a few sentences. For some people with depression, this form of help is beneficial because it provides a sense of being needed without excessive emotional strain. At the same time, the lack of relational continuity means that the therapeutic effect may be superficial and quickly fade if not accompanied by other forms of inner work. Educational volunteering, helping young people with learning, tutoring, mentoring, rests on an asymmetry of competence rather than an asymmetry of suffering. The volunteer functions here as a capable person who possesses resources to share. For some people with depression, this can be strengthening, as it rebuilds a sense of worth and usefulness. For others, it can be burdensome, especially when depression is accompanied by a strong sense of inadequacy or fear of evaluation. The relationship here is more cognitive than emotional, which limits its therapeutic depth. Organizations that support older adults in everyday functioning, shopping, companionship, small household help sit somewhere between task-based and relational volunteering. The contact is more personal than meal distribution, but usually less intense than in care homes or hospices. For people with depression, this can be a form of gentle relational training based on regularity and simple activities, without the need to enter extreme emotional states. Volunteering with organizations helping people with addictions can be particularly deceptive from a therapeutic perspective. On the one hand, contact with individuals in acute crisis may strongly relativize one's own problems. On the other hand, such environments are characterized by high instability, relapse, manipulation, and disappointment. For a person with depression, especially one prone to over-responsibility or rescuing, this form of volunteering can quickly lead to exhaustion and frustration. It is not an emotionally neutral space and is generally discouraged during the treatment of depression, all the more so because addiction and depression often share similar underlying mechanisms. Organizations caring for animals are often perceived as a safe alternative to working with people. Indeed, contact with animals can be emotionally regulating and less cognitively demanding. At the same time, this form of volunteering is often physically demanding, monotonous, and lacking in clear feedback. Helping animals rarely provides a rapid sense of meaning comparable to human relationships. For some people with depression, it may be a valuable form of stabilization and a return to an action rhythm. At the same time, in the case of people with depression, particular caution is needed with volunteering that consists exclusively of caring for animals. Depression tends to foster avoidance of human relationships, and contact with animals may be used as a safe substitute. An animal does not judge, confront, require dialogue, or demand emotional reciprocity at a level that might be difficult to bear. For some, contact with animals is regulating and stabilizing. For others, it can reinforce withdrawal and deepen social isolation. In such cases, volunteering at an animal shelter does not serve a therapeutic function but becomes a form of escape from people rather than a return to relationship. Therefore, helping animals should be treated as a supportive or transitional tool, not as the primary form of social activation in the treatment of depression, especially when a strong tendency to avoid human contact is present. A common feature of most of these forms of volunteering is that they do not directly touch the existential core so powerfully revealed in hospices or in work with children. They provide structure, occupation, social contact, and a limited sense of meaning. For many people, this is sufficient. For others, it is too shallow to move anything essential. It must be said honestly, not every form of helping treats depression, even if it is socially valuable. Some activities function like a bandage. They bring temporary relief and structure to the day, but do not change the deeper experience of emptiness or disconnection. Other forms of helping act like a catalyst, not because they are better, but because they resonate with the particular sensitivity of a given person. Therefore, the choice of volunteering should not be based on what is currently available or morally approved, but on a realistic assessment of one's mental state, tolerance for chaos, emotional needs, and capacity for relationship. Helping others is not a universal remedy. It can, however, be one of the few ways for a person with depression to feel again that their presence matters, provided that the form of help is not accidental. Summary: volunteering is not a universal cure for depression and should not be treated as such. It can, however, become a concrete therapeutic tool if chosen consciously, in alignment with the person's current mental state and real capacities. Its value does not lie in the moral superiority of helping others, but in shifting attention from inner suffering to relationship, action, and presence. Different forms of volunteering work in different ways. Some stabilize through rhythm and simple usefulness, others confront with boundary experiences of life, still others help rebuild the capacity for relationship without excessive expectations. There is no single right form of helping, only one that supports the healing process at a given moment, and one that unnecessarily complicates it. It is also crucial to understand that volunteering exposes the real world, not its safe simulation. Contact with poverty, illness, old age, death, or childhood trauma is not a neutral experience. For some, it leads to a re-evaluation of their own problems and a restoration of meaning. For others, it proves too burdensome. This difference does not testify to strength or weakness of character, but to individual sensitivity and the stage of illness. Volunteering can help a person with depression feel needed, seen, and emotionally present again. It can also reveal limits previously unnoticed. In both cases, it fulfills its role, provided it is not treated as an escape or a substitute for treatment, but as a consciously used tool within a broader healing process. Helping others does not heal by itself. It can, however, create conditions in which healing ceases to be an abstract idea and begins to truly happen, through relationship, through action, and through direct contact with reality.